Welcome to Let's Talk, Episode 2. In this episode, we are going to talk about lighting the Un-lightable from NyghtVision Magazine, Volume 9, Number 3. Before we begin, I want to make sure that you know that this presentation is rated M for mature. There is mature content. In this case, there are photographs of a woman nude from the waist up, part of a fine art nude series that we did in Charlotte, North Carolina. I always like to start with the 5,000-foot overview. And as we've seen before, the key components are logistics, planning, and ultimately execution. Let's begin by talking first about the logistics piece. The key is to make sure you have everything you need all the time. It's very difficult to come back when you're 85 miles away or even more from home. As I've mentioned in a previous presentation, this means that we usually start packing the car at 6 a.m., assuming we're going to be on the road by 8 or 8:30 in the morning. Planning, before I show up, I want to know exactly what I want to accomplish. What gear will I need? What is the emotional effect I'm going to be looking for? And ultimately, what are the technical challenges that I'm going to face? And then, of course, I want to execute. Believe it or not, this is the back of the car prior to the shoot. I want you to notice a few things. First of all the gear is laid out symmetrically. Number two, with the think tank bags in the back, the handles are facing forward. That way I can easily remove them. This is my primary camera bag with my vintage lenses. I'm simply going to pick it up by the handle. It'll be up on its bottom, and I can remove it safely. This is my laptop bag. It was raining. You can see that the same thing is true. The handle is clearly available. I just need to lift it up. In terms of other gear that you're seeing, these are light stands. My tripod is tucked under here in the event that I would need it. Not visible behind my backpack, which contains my laptop, the trigger for the ProPhoto strobes, are the lenses and the Fresnel heads. We'll be talking more about Fresnel technology. So, as you can see, everything is neat, everything is organized. It's exactly the way it will be the next time I travel. Everything is always completely arranged symmetrically and in order. If you think this is being anal retentive, I want to remind you that if you're out on a professional shoot and you don't have an important piece of gear, that can cost you a client. Or conversely, if you're out on a shoot, you finish the shoot and you pack up, and you can't quickly identify the fact that all the gear is or isn't there, that's a recipe for losing some very expensive equipment. So here's a list of the gear that I used. Pentax 645Z, which is a medium format camera. The filters that I will be using will vary from 77 to 95 millimeter, depending on the lens. The sensor here is 6 by 4.5. By comparison, a full frame DSLR is 2 by 3. So, significantly larger. If you've been following us for the last year, then you know that I've been focusing a lot on vintage lenses. One of my favorite is the Pentax 6x7 55 to 100. In case you're wondering what the 6x7 was, if you think about sensor size, if there were a digital back available, then the 6x7 would literally be 6x7. Considerably larger 30% larger than the sensor in my 645Z. We're going to come back and talk about crop factor, but for the moment, let's keep looking at the gear. The Pentax 6x7 100mm lens, technically this is a macro lens. However, there is an insert that can be put into the front of the lens. You can see that in the review that we did of this lens in the magazine, which will convert it to quite the macro lens. Or without it, it becomes quite a good portrait lens. I'd never shot with it before. It had just arrived. I decided I'd give it a try as a portrait lens. And finally, almost finally, the Profoto B4 battery pack and heads, and Fresnel heads and lenses. Let's talk first about the crop factor. Okay. The 100mm 6x7 lens is 30% larger than my 645 sensor. As a consequence of that, it comes out to being exactly a 70mm lens. The same thing is true converting a 645 to a full-frame DSLR. There is a crop factor, again, of about 30%. And from a full-frame DSLR to an APS-C digital sensor. Effectively, when I'm using a vintage lens, if this is the lens mouth, I'm going to be using the sharpest part. There's been a lot of debate within the company based upon people's response to some of the images that I've created. I find the images very different, in part because I am shooting directly through the front of the lens. I do want to note, however, that there is a bit of a shortcoming, and that is in part, if I'm shooting through the sharpest part of the lens, I'm going to be okay in terms of overall image quality. But the 6x7 lenses were all manual. Manual focus is not necessarily a big problem. However, my 645 can't see the aperture setting. Aperture in these lenses is set on the lens, not, if you're accustomed to a DSLR, through a button on the body of the camera. So not only am I working with a lens that requires manual focus, the camera is essentially blind to the aperture. I've learned through trial and error that particularly with that 55 to 100, if I underexpose by 2 stops, I'm going to be okay. Now, one of the things that we want to think about with that lens is the fact that it has a mouth that's 95 millimeters. Huge when you consider most of my other lenses are 77. So what that effectively means is that a lot of extra light is coming in, and I need to make sure, one way or the other, that I'm able to control the amount of light that comes in. Even when I'm 2 f-stops under that lens is still letting in a tremendous amount of light, far beyond what I typically expect. So I've got to be able to take that into account at all times when I'm working. So let's go back to our presentation and pick up there. You may remember that at the end here we mentioned Fresnel heads and lenses. Fresnel technology is truly unique. If we think about light as diffusing over distance and time, in most cases when a strobe or a flash fires, you get a wide angle of diffusion over any given distance. And while some of the center of the light will remain intact, by far and away the diffusion will cause the light to become very soft very, very quickly. With Fresnel adapters, this is no longer true. Fresnel technology, which was primarily used in lighthouses, is designed to keep the beam of light more consistent and closer over any change in time and any change in distance. I've discovered through trial and error that the inner third remains extremely consistent over a very long period of time, and the outer third diffuses similarly to the way a typical strobe will diffuse. Now, having said that, it's important to note that working with Fresnel lights introduces a variety of parameters that we ordinarily don't take into account. If you've read some of the past editions of Lighting the Un-lightable, you know that typically what we try to do is break the light to produce what we call a consistent volume of light, and we'll be talking more about that. With Fresnel lights, I basically have to focus on the outer 2/3 to get the visual effect that I want to achieve. So, having said that, let's now go back and pick up our presentation. It really is about ritual, and I know we've talked about this, but I don't want to underestimate it. Ritual begins in my world from the moment I get up on the morning of a shoot, and it ends at night when the car is unpacked and all the gear is stowed exactly where it always is stowed. Ritual is doing the same thing the same way all the time. If you think about the expense of some of the gear that we have, if we were to leave it behind at a job site, it would be virtually irreplaceable. But ritual also applies to being able to maintain a consistent look and feel, fewer errors, better execution, and ultimately, if you want to develop your own artistic or photographic style, this becomes critically important. If you know anything about our company, if you don't, check out our website, check out the magazine. You know we have a clearly identifiable style. We all use it, we all adhere to it, and it's one of the reasons why our work has been branded and is recognizable. So, the basic questions. Whenever we're working, we focus on what day, what time, where am I, angle, direction, and intensity of light, and ultimately the volume of light. Let's take a look at these. If you think about day and time, today is the 13th of August, and the four most important days of the year for a photographer are September 21st, December 21st, March 21st, and June 21st. If you're familiar at all with these, then you know that these are the equinox. Effectively, the amount of light that is lost or gained every day is predictable. In the Greensboro area, it's plus or minus 3 minutes over the course of the year, varying from each of the equinoxes to the solstices. So at this point, 30 days in June, the 21st was 9 days. I'm 13 days into August. I now have 22 minutes less light than I had roughly a month ago. That will continue to diminish until December 21st. But just as important is the fact that the angle of light is changing. The shorter the day, the lower to the horizon the light will come. This has a profound impact on how both the human eye and the camera see color. As far as the direction of light, it's always the same in the northern hemisphere, from east to west through the south. And as you'll see momentarily when we look at the first image, all of these had a profound impact on the shoot, particularly since the apartment was facing north. So, by ritualizing each of these parameters, I have the ability to unconsciously focus on the details that are absolutely critical for me to produce the quality image I want and to manipulate the variables that are involved in the light wherever it is I'm working that day. So, one of the points that I want to make is that we can't always guarantee that what I see is what is real. I'll give you an example. Early, before I became a professional photographer in the fall of 2002, I took a trip to Philly. Well, I was on my way to New York. I stopped in Philly. It was about 11 p.m. at night, and I was near the famous art museum. I'm sure you know all about the Rocky films. And I stopped to take a look at some of the surrounding areas. It was misty and foggy, and I stopped and set up my tripod for a long exposure, took a number of shots, drove on to New York. When I got to New York, booted up my laptop. Lo and behold, all of the images were yellow, and I said to myself, how could that possibly be? Well, that could be because our brains are conditioned to think about light as white, just as our brains are conditioned to think about the sky as blue. So, the camera can't interpolate. It sees what it sees. To be successful as a photographer, it's important to be able to see through the lens, as they used to say. Seeing through the lens means that you see the world the way the camera sees the world, not the way you've been taught by your culture to see the world. So, the volume of light is absolutely critical, and momentarily we're going to focus on that when we talk about Gabriel Lippmann. We also want to talk about the angle of light and the law of inverse square. The law governing the angle of light says that light reflects at the complement of the angle with which it strikes an object. If it strikes a wall at 45 degrees, it will reflect at 135. Now, I want to be clear that light in the real world is not a tightly integrated beam. As soon as your strobe is firing, or your flash on your camera, As we saw before, the light's going to diffuse over time and distance. So effectively, you're dealing with a kind of cone from one end of the diffusion pattern to the other. And in each case, the light will reflect at the complement of the angle. This can be very effective if you understand that, because if you notice this arrow here, when it runs into another part of the beam of light, effectively, it's going to reflect again at the complement of the angle. Why is that important? Ultimately, because it helps produce what we call the volume of light, which Gabriel Lippmann referred to as standing waves of light. Lippmann won the Nobel Prize in 1908 for a theory of light very similar to the one that we use. Check out his work, it's quite fascinating. So let's go back now and let's talk about the law of inverse square. The law of inverse square says that the intensity of light is a function of your distance from the object, and that can be expressed in the inverse of the square. So if I'm 4 feet away from, let's say, a chair that I'm photographing or a model, the square of 4 is 16. The inverse of the square is 1/16, which means effectively I have lost 15/16 of the light from my strobe, from my flash, from the sun, whatever the source of light is, simply in a matter of 4 feet. So when I'm lighting a scene, when I'm thinking about what I want to convey emotionally and visually, I'm going to have to take this into account. Now, I want to make another point here that's very important. We've touched on it in a previous presentation. A photograph is a visual invitation. To an emotional experience. However, as much as you might be able to convey an emotional experience with any photograph, the better you manage the technical issues, the more powerful the emotional experience. So I like to say it's art plus technology that equals a photographic image. We'll come back to this a little bit later on, and we will certainly come back to it in other presentations. But for the moment, let's leave it there, and let's head back to the presentation. Understanding color. Color is produced by the way that light moves through a given space. The wavelength of light, essentially a sine curve, varies with the relationship of light to the density of the atmosphere. So what that means, if this is a tree that I'm photographing, at the high point of the day, which is roughly 2 p.m. in Greensboro, North Carolina, on June the 21st, the sun will be here. By September 21st, the sun will be here. by December 21st, the sun will be there. The atmosphere is most dense closest to the surface. And the closer you are to sea level, the more moisture, and therefore the more dense the atmosphere is. In North Carolina in the summer, where you can easily get 90% humidity, this atmosphere can become extremely dense. The impact on that is that oftentimes colors tend to the yellow, red, magenta, burgundy end of the spectrum, whereas during winter time, or in the middle of June, when the sun is at its peak, you're going to get more towards blue, white, and gray. If you don't understand this, then your images will never produce the kind of color you're looking for. A couple of things while we're here, by the way. Most of your camera manuals will tell you to keep the sun at your back. That's actually wrong, because what will happen is the sun will strike the object, and as we've seen with our conversation about the angle of light, it'll come right back at your face. Ideally, you always want to keep the light across the scene, whatever it is you're photographing. But we'll talk more about that in another episode of our series. Let's go back to our presentation. If you notice what's happening here, periodically all three colors are peaking and troughing at exactly the same time. Gabriel Lippmann called that effect standing waves of light. We refer to it as the volume of light. The volume of light is either consistent or inconsistent. I want the volume of light to be consistent because when it is, I get incredible detail, color, texture, contrast, and ultimately a fantastic emotional experience. How do we know? As we mentioned before, we do and we don't. We've developed enough experience and we've worked the math enough to have a pretty good idea of how it's going to work. But really it becomes another form of ritual. We always solve our problems in the field in exactly the same way, using exactly the same technology, and the results, therefore, are predictable, and we don't have to spend a tremendous amount of time getting the effect we're looking for. So we went down to Charlotte to work with Anonym, and this is the first setup. By the way, these are the Fresnel heads, and you can see one of the lenses. In this one, I used a lens that would concentrate the light and make it sharper. In this one, I actually used a lens that would soften the light. Now, a couple of things, I determined very quickly that this part of the apartment was facing north. Could I tell when I was in the apartment? No, not really. But when I got out of the car and began unloading my gear, I noticed that my shadows pointed in this direction. In the northern hemisphere, our shadows always point in the general direction of north. I knew as a consequence of the fact that this was pointing to the north that I wouldn't have to deal with a lot of the issues caused by the movement of the sun across the front of the apartment while we were working. By the way, here's the B4 battery pack. Here's the case with the Fresnel lenses. And if you notice, all the shadows on the wall are soft, an indication that the volume of light would be consistent. Notice, too, that these are pointed down at a fairly sharp angle. That one more than this one. And my goal, when Anonym was sitting here, was to have one more or less come behind her and the other more or less in front of her. kind of wrapping the light around her. I typically don't do that, but given the nature of the environment in which we were working, I decided that was the way to go. Here's one of the first photos. Notice the soft shadows on her face. Notice the detail in the garment is absolutely breathtaking. The clarity of her eyes, all of the detail of her hair, absolutely lovely. A second image, same set, same lighting. Notice the detail in the couch. Notice the detail in her hair. Absolutely stunning. So this is the next scene. We're right up against the window here. And I had really serious concerns. I didn't want the reflection from the lights and other aspects of the apartment to overshadow her. And you can see here the Fresnel head. Once again, the softer one, the harsher one here. And if you follow it down, it's basically going to come over the top of her body between her and me. And this one is going to come in similar fashion, straight down. Once again, the idea was to wrap her in the light, compensate for the light coming in from the windows. And by the way, notice they're sharper here, the shadows, and they taper off relatively quickly. One of the photos from that last set. The background is softer here because I was close to minimum focusing distance. Minimum focusing distance is how close you can get to whatever it is you're photographing and still lock focus. The closer you get to minimum focusing distance, the shallower your f-stop, the shallower your depth of field, regardless of the f-stop you use. The third set looked like this. We don't have any photographs, so I had to use a drawing. I want you to know that initially this is the area where we were working. This is where the couch was, obviously the windows. And in this case, she was going to be working here on top of a gorgeous pool table that had a wooden cover. One of the lights was placed directly behind her at about 45 degrees to where she would be, and the other at 45. This one was more powerful than this one. This one had the softer Fresnel lens. This had the harsher one. And the idea, again, was to wrap her in light. I had to be careful because the wooden surface of the pool table could very quickly and very easily become highly reflective. When light strikes an object and comes right back at your face or right back at the camera, whatever it is becomes a mirror. We find that all the time when we're doing architectural photography with glass. This is one of the images. Now, were I to do it again, I might worry more about these. They are a bit of a distraction, but in the final image, I can easily remove them and will. In this case, we change the angle just slightly. Instead of directly hitting her, it's coming down at a sharper angle and hitting the white of her garment here. That created an extra shadow here and added more texture to the wood. I liked it a lot. Notice also here that we've added a fairly sharp shadow, but it isn't so black that we've lost any of the detail, color, texture, contrast. From another angle, she's laying down now. Notice again that however dark this is, I haven't lost any of the detail. And notice that how bright this is, I still haven't lost any of the detail. Gets close in here, And were I to do it again, I'd probably change my f-stop or move that light just a little bit. Notice how nicely the shadows fall across her body. And by the way, you know that you've got the volume of light consistent whenever you can see directly through the windows. Finally, toward the end of the shoot, I was determined to try the 100mm and to see how good a portrait lens it was. So this is still our pool table. Anonim moved here, and I moved the backlight here, and I pulled the light that had been here over in this direction. It took a little bit of experimentation initially because the 100mm has a 77mm mouth, and therefore far less light will enter that lens than entered my 55 to 100. I also wasn't sure how close I needed to be in order to get the kind of detail I wanted without making her look unreal or unnatural. Here's one of the first images. I was extremely pleased. Notice this is softly focused. Notice this is very tack sharp along with some areas over here. Again, remember at this point I am right at minimum focusing distance, so whatever my f-stop is, in this case it was set to 14, which should give me a tremendous depth of field has collapsed. When depth of field collapses, the background becomes soft as depth of field becomes thinner and thinner. By the way, one of the big things we talk about these days is bokeh. Absolutely love the bokeh of that lens. I want to do more work on this image. I'm not sure what happened to her there, but I do want to fix that. I will probably also soften some of the detail here. I don't want her to be unnatural in how she looks, but I do want to touch up some of those imperfections. Probably my most favorite image of the day. Absolutely the same lighting. You can see the light from her hair here. You can see the other light here. I brought enough of it across to create the drama of this side of her face while adding very soft shadows as her hair pulled away from her face here. I had to worry about this. I can darken that up without too much trouble. It's almost beyond recovery, but I'm sure I can fix that. And I love her hands. So expressive, so deeply emotional. Once again, I'll probably do a little bit of touch-up work there. So, in summary, every time I finish a shoot, I ask myself, what is it I've learned? And typically, I try to find 2 or 3 things that I learned. Number one, I have shot in areas of homes or buildings where I'm facing north, but this was the first time the entire shoot had glass facing the north. I also learned that since the property was shaped like that and we were here, that even though I was facing north, there was a considerable amount of light being reflected from this part of the complex, both back to the other side and in, and from there and in. And there were a couple of times where I had to be very cognizant of the fact that I was creating a mirror-like condition on the windows facing outwardly. Number 2, I learned that the macro lens with a much smaller opening made for an incredibly beautiful bokeh in the background. I loved the way it handled her face. However, I also learned that there are aspects of using that lens, for example, the very shallow depth of field, that I have to be extremely careful about. If I don't make sure my focus is dead on, I'm going to end up with an unusable image. Remember, as we said before, these lenses are all manual. Even though I have a 49-point focusing system in my 645Z, it will not do me any good when I'm using a vintage lens. I have to make sure that I have in focus that which is most appealing and that which I want to convey to my viewer. 3, I was reminded again that human skin is a highly reflective surface and that I have to pay close attention to how the light reflects on a particular person. In Anonym's case, because of her Asian background, she reflected far more light than she absorbed. Potentially, that was a problem. The combination of having run into that situation before and the apartment facing north helped mitigate any potential problems that we would have faced. And lastly, if you look at Lighting the Un-lightable in NyghtVision magazine volume 9, number 3, which we will be releasing by the end of August, you'll see a number of photos at the beginning of the article that I had to use in order to finally determine what f-stop, shutter speed, etc. I was going to use. Had it been one of my 645 lenses, I would have known from years of working with them. But again, that 55 to 100 has a 95 millimeter opening, and that means a tremendous amount of light comes in. Well, we're done. We'll be coming back shortly with an actual product review of Sorae's neutral density filters. We're going to be looking at the Pentax 6x7 100 macro. And ultimately, in addition to the Sorae round filters, we're going to be looking at Sorae rectangular neutral density filters. We'll talk about what a neutral density filter is, when to use them, why to use them, and how they can help you improve your photography. So thank you for listening. My name is Falcon. I'm the senior partner of the House of NyghtFalcon. Have a great night.